Welcome, everyone, to episode 1.5 of Echoes of the Missing, our companion series, Nick's Got Questions. I'm your host, Jamie, and I'm here with my piano man, Nick. Say hi.
Hi.
First, thank you for listening in. We're so glad you're here. If you haven't had a chance to listen to episode 1 yet, I'd encourage you to start there. It's going to give you the full story of the case we're going to chat about today. So, if there's one thing you should know about Nick, it's that he has questions about everything. This man loves to ask a question, and they're always good ones. They definitely keep my brain functioning at maximum capacity. So, Nick, you've got your milk.
I sure do.
And I've got my matcha.
And I've got questions.
The conversation about Terrence Woods Jr. continues. And I'll be honest, after wrapping up episode 1, I kept digging. The more I researched, the more frustrated I became with the way this investigation was handled. It felt like every answer led to more questions. So let's get into it. All right, Nick, hit me with your first question.
Okay. So what is the last photographic evidence of Terrence?
That's actually a really interesting question because the honest answer is we don't know. There is no publicly identified last known photograph of Terrence before he disappeared on October 5th, 2018. There isn't a single photograph of Terrence Woods Jr. during his trip to Montana or Idaho. Think about that for a second. We don't have a photo of him from the airport. We don't have a photo of him from the plane. We don't have a photo of him with the crew on or off the set. We don't even have a group photo that includes him from the trip. We don't have a photo of him at the hotel. We don't have a photo of him from the restaurant where the crew had dinner together. We don't have a photo of him at the filming location. The only publicly known images connected to that trip are landscape photos Terrence reportedly sent to his father and a final social media post showing scenery in Idaho from a hotel window. In every one of those images, Terrence is supposedly behind the camera, not in front of it. Every photo we've come to recognize in news stories and on missing persons posters were from Terrence's life before the trip. What do you think about that?
Okay. I find that pretty interesting. So there's basically nothing of him with the crew at all. The crew has photographs together. Terrence isn't in any of those. So not only is he not in those photos, but is there any surveillance video or footage or photographs or anything that would indicate he was in either of these two places, Montana or Idaho?
There's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. There's no photographs. There's no video footage. There's no surveillance footage. And I mean, I find this mind-blowing. This was a television production. Cameras were everywhere. And yet, from the public's perspective, there isn't a single released photograph of Terrence during his trip to either Montana or Idaho. Not one. Not one. I don't know. That's just really hard for me to wrap my head around. Okay, Nick, hit me with your next question.
So my understanding is that Terrence called his father when he arrived in Montana, not texted him. This is important because it's different than when he arrived in Idaho, where he supposedly only texted. So can you confirm that? I mean, a call more clearly places him in Montana, but a text could be made by someone who was somehow able to get access to his phone, and maybe that text wasn't, maybe he didn't text it himself. And then as a follow-up, do Terrence's family members believe those texts during the Idaho leg of the trip actually were sent by him?
Yeah, so that's actually correct. From everything I've been able to verify, Terrence called his father after arriving in Montana. His father recognized his voice. He knew he had safely made it that far. But after that, the communication changed. The family began receiving text messages, including messages indicating he was leaving to come home early. What's interesting is that Terrence's father has said publicly that he doesn't believe those final messages were sent by his son. In interviews, he's explained that those messages don't sound like Terrence, and the idea that Terrence would just walk away in the middle of a professional production is completely out of character. Now, does that prove that someone else sent those messages? No. I haven't found any public evidence proving that. But it does explain why Terrence Sr. questions the authenticity of those texts and why he's never accepted the official narrative. And I can't say that I blame him for having doubts. I would too. So, does that scratch your itch on that one, or do you have some more thoughts?
Well, I'm a little curious about when Terrence Sr. says his text didn't sound like him. Did he ever go into any kind of depth about that? Did he elaborate? Was it just something like, okay, he's like writing in like short kind of, you know, sentences. Maybe, he normally writes more colorfully, or, maybe everything's like perfectly punctuated, and maybe, these texts are coming in with like misspellings, or, I don't know. Is there anything that like was it just a feeling that he had, or was there something specific that he was able to zero in on with those text messages?
From everything I've looked at, it doesn't sound like he gave any specifics like that as to why he didn't think it was Terrence, but I like how you're thinking. And I would love to dive into that further. So make a note for me.
Okay.
And I'm gonna bring this back because I think that's a really great question. From everything that I've looked at, it seems like he just didn't think that his son would walk away in the middle of a job. That's kind of the impression I get as to why he feels like this potentially wasn't Terrence. Like, it just was really outside of his character.
Okay.
Um,
It's not just the text, but just the whole uh, behavior in general just
right.
didn't really sound like him at all.
You got it. All right. What else do you have for me?
So the sheriff has said he's done all he can do. So my question is that really true? Has he asked the FBI to help? And additionally, if no one is looking for Terrence, why is the case still open?
Yeah. So I did look into this, and from everything I've been able to verify, there hasn't been any public indication that the sheriff has requested the FBI to take over or provide investigative assistance in Terrence's case. As far as the public has been told, this has remained a local investigation. Now, the second part of your question is one that a lot of people ask. If there aren't any active searches happening, why is the case still open? Well, an open case doesn't necessarily mean that investigators are actively searching every day or at all. It simply means the case hasn't been solved. If a credible tip comes in tomorrow or new evidence is discovered, they can reopen leads and continue working on the case. Now, this is where I want to share my personal opinion. I know I can't know what's in the sheriff's mind, and I can't say that he doesn't care, but from the outside looking in, that's how it can feel. If you truly believe that every possibility has been exhausted, then maybe you don't see a reason to bring in additional resources. But I struggle with that. This is a young man who vanished without a trace. When you have no body, no crime scene, no confirmed explanation, and years later you still don't have answers, I have a hard time understanding why you wouldn't want every available resource, including the FBI, to take another look.
Yeah, I think that's really almost necessary, I would say, to get the FBI involved and to really, to, get traction on this case. I mean, it doesn't sound like there's anything else, the sheriff's department can really do that need to, they need some help. And it'd be good to find a way to, you know, put some pressure on them and say, "Hey, why can't you do this? What's the reason that you're not asking um, help for?"
Yeah, and that's a really good point because the FBI can't just come in and insist on taking over a case. That local sheriff's department has to ask them for help. They have to turn it over to them. And yeah, it just doesn't really make any sense as to why they wouldn't want the help. They've exhausted, it sounds like, according to the sheriff, he's exhausted resources. There's nothing else that he can do. You think he'd want to turn it over to, someone who does have extensive resources, but that's just not happening. It kind of reminds me a lot of the Nancy Guthrie case and the sheriff in that investigation, just being really hesitant to reach out for help, and I just don't understand that way of thinking. I don't know if it's ego, I don't know what it is, but it's frustrating.
Yeah. And, another thing about when the FBI can get involved, I mean, we're not sure if, something happened in Montana or Idaho. You got things, information crossing state lines. It seems like, the FBI could still get involved, maybe not necessarily take over, but at least work with the sheriff's department. But, it'd be good to dig into that a little more and just kind of figure out, you know, when, um, when the FBI can get involved in something like this without, you know, the the sheriff necessarily, you know, asking for help. So
Right.
um, I just think knowing that um, would be a good step in getting some answers.
I agree. And when I look at both the actions that were taken and just as importantly, the actions that weren't, it just feels like the sheriff's office never truly considered this a potential crime. Instead, they just seemed to accept that initial narrative that Terrence was experiencing a mental health crisis and didn't look much beyond that. Whether that assumption was correct or not, it shouldn't have changed the urgency of the search or the investigation, regardless of the circumstances surrounding Terrence's disappearance. This family deserves to know what happened and to bring their son home. And I would think that they would be open to bringing on whatever resources are necessary in order to do that, including the FBI. So, as far as I'm concerned, no, he hasn't done all he can do. Okay. What else? What's your next question, Nick?
Have you reached out to anyone on the case?
I have. I've submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, and I'm waiting to hear back on that. Outside of the FOIA request, I have reached out to Terrence Woods Sr. because I would love the opportunity to speak with him. I completely understand that he's received countless messages over the years and hasn't seen mine, and that's okay. And this is where I'd like to open up an invitation to anyone out there listening. If you're connected to Terrence's case in any way, whether you're a family member, a friend, someone who worked on the production, someone involved in the investigation, or someone with firsthand knowledge and you're willing to talk, I would love to hear from you. You can email me at echoesofthemissingpodcast@gmail.com or reach out through any of my social media channels. If your information helps us better understand this case, I'll do everything I can to verify it before sharing. What else you got for me?
Have you read the police report released by the Idaho County Sheriff's Department? And if so, what does it say?
No, and I wish I could tell you. There isn't a publicly released, comprehensive police report in Terrence's case. Over the years, Terrence's father has requested the investigative file, and those requests have been denied. News organizations, including Dateline, have also requested records and have been denied. The Idaho County Sheriff's Office has maintained that the case is still open and active, and that's the reason they've given for not releasing the complete file. Now, some documents have become public over the years, things like the 911 call, portions of dispatch information and other records, but the full report has never been released publicly. And that's actually why I submitted my own FOIA request. I honestly don't know what, if anything, I'll receive. It may be heavily redacted or denied altogether. But if records are released, I don't want to read them alone. I want all of you, and of course, Nick, to experience that moment with me. My plan is to go live, open the records for the first time together, and read through them as a community. Maybe they'll answer some questions, or maybe they'll leave us with more. Until then, everything I've shared in episode 1 and everything we're discussing today has come from publicly available sources that I've spent a lot of time researching.
Okay, so basically, it sounds like there's a lot of documents. We're not really sure what they are. Many of them most likely heavily redacted, but the actual police report, if we get that, I mean, obviously it's not the full report, but if we get part of the police report, it's most likely very heavily redacted, names probably left off. Um, Basically, anything that's helpful is most likely not in there.
Right. All right. What else is on your mind?
I have a question about the Raw TV crew. Were
Mm.
they uh, tight knit? Did they always work together? Was Terrence an outsider? Anybody else that worked with the crew, did they have any issues? Maybe feeling like they were an outsider, maybe not um, one of the crew.
So now this one is interesting because it's one of the few areas where there's actually been some reporting beyond the sheriff's office. First, this wasn't Terrence's first job with Raw TV. He had worked for the company before. But from everything I found, this was his first time working with this particular production crew. Several members of the crew had already worked together, and so those relationships were already established before Terrence arrived. An extensive investigation by Deadline Hollywood paints a picture of a crew that wasn't particularly welcoming to newcomers. Former industry insiders described a pretty insular boys' club culture where new people could have a hard time fitting in. According to that reporting, there were signs that Terrence wasn't happy on the production, and law enforcement documents referenced what was described as an uneasy dynamic between him and some of the crew. One local source even told investigators that there were several people who weren't happy with Terrence, and that Terrence wasn't really happy with them either. Now, Raw TV has publicly disputed the idea that there was any significant conflict on set. So I want to be sure to include that. But of course, they're going to say that. No company wants to admit to a hostile work environment. As for whether anyone else working with the crew had similar issues, I could only find some things stating that it can be a difficult culture for outsiders on these types of productions. Whether that had any role in what happened to Terrence, we simply don't know. But nothing specific about specific employees having issues with this particular crew.
Okay. And sounds like any information you have is just very anecdotal, nothing
Right.
like um, really well documented.
Correct. Okay. Next question.
Want to ask about the clothes in um, Terrence's suitcase. So we're sure that the clothes in his suitcase were clean. Could he have folded up clothes he had already worn? Um, what happened to his dirty clothes? Do you know anything more about the contents of that suitcase?
Yeah, so that's actually one detail I feel pretty certain about because Terrence Sr. showed the suitcase with the clothes on Dr. Phil. So I've seen them. I mean, they looked clean from what I could tell just from, watching it on a screen. They looked clean, ironed. They had been packed in a suitcase. And I'm going to refer to Terrence Sr. on this one because he knows his son's laundry and packing habits and can confirm that the clothes were clean. As a mom, I can tell you that I was always able to tell if my teenage son's clothes were clean. I would, you can smell them and tell if they're clean or not. And I don't know, maybe he did a smell test, but he was very certain that these were clean clothes. What fascinates me, though, even more is what was sitting next to the clothes. And that is a pair of muddy dress shoes, formal shoes placed inside of a plastic bag. So, according to Terrence's father, those shoes went with a formal outfit, and that formal outfit was missing altogether. And this is where you're going to get my unfiltered thoughts. So, I keep coming back to those shoes. How did they get muddy? Did Terrence wear them? And if he did, when? Was he wearing them out on that terrain, the muddy terrain? Surely he wasn't scrambling around that terrain in a formal suit, right? And if he didn't wear them, then how did they end up muddy? And my mind goes in 100 different directions. Did he walk those shoes out into the mud himself? Did someone else? Did someone else wear his shoes? Could someone have taken them out after the fact to create a narrative that Terrence had been out there in the mud? I have absolutely no evidence that that happened, but that's where my mind takes me.
Yeah, this is a really interesting detail. I just have so many questions about it. I mean, it seems kind of like a mundane detail, but a lot of questions I have is like, how many clothing outfits was he supposed to have? And really like his dirty clothes, what did he do with his dirty clothes? Why didn't those get handed back to his parents?
Exactly.
Why, I'm kind of curious about the timeline. It's like, okay, so, you know, if all his if all the his parents got back were, you know, a few sets of clean clothes, it's like, well, what happened to everything else? And
Right.
it kind of makes me wonder about the timeline. Because there isn't, you know, any conclusive evidence of, when, we have the story of supposedly when he disappeared, but if it could have happened before then, if that, that nothing really seems to add up with the story. So, if there's something else, if he went missing before then and then the story was made up. I'm not saying it was, but um, it kind of comes back to the clothes and um, just the fact that, there's it just seems so odd. It seems so very odd.
Yeah, it's definitely odd. And I can't stop thinking about the possibility that somebody said, we got to make it look like he was here and took those shoes out and put him in the mud and I'll die on that hill.
Although that raises more questions than not because it's like, okay, so why are just these shoes muddy? Why would you get these shoes muddy?
Right. Because it's documented that Terrence, when he was out in the field, he wore hiking boots, right? So why are dress shoes muddy? Or is it that I'm going to really go out on a limb here? Were his hiking boots no longer available for them to put back in the hotel room because they're somewhere, wherever Terrence
Wherever he
is,
is.
that, yeah, I think you pick up on what I'm putting down.
Yeah. 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 Very interesting.
Very interesting indeed. Okay, I'm ready for your next one.
All right. So Raw TV reached out to Terrence for the job, and they had worked with him before. So, other than not knowing which kind of fruit Simon would want, are there any other job related issues that Simon complained about other than he was acting strange?
I love this question because, yes, Raw TV had worked with Terrence before. This wasn't his first assignment with a company, but it was apparently the first time with this specific group of people. As far as Simon Gee's complaints, they went beyond the fruit story. So, according to Terrence's parents, Simon also criticized him for things like hesitating to do basic assistant tasks, not knowing how to open certain camera equipment, and asking questions instead of somehow just knowing what was expected. His parents described those conversations as a stream of criticism about Terrence's performance. Now, here's where things get complicated. Raw TV and Simon Gee have publicly disputed a lot of that. They say Terrence wasn't called a disappointment and that their comments were taken out of context. Simon said that he was simply describing Terrence as distracted and trying to determine whether that behavior was normal for him. What makes this difficult is that those accounts are directly at odds with what Terrence's family said happened. And personally, this is one of the areas where I struggle. By every account outside of this scenario, Terrence had built a really impressive career. He had worked in television for years. He had credits on major productions, and former coworkers consistently described him as intelligent, dependable, and someone they loved working with. So when I hear this long list of complaints that only seems to surface after he disappears, I can't help but wonder, were these genuine concerns? Were they exaggerated? Were people trying to make sense of what happened after the fact? I don't know. But I think it's fair to say these competing narratives deserve to be examined, not just accepted at face value.
Okay. So what Raw TV is saying is that the reason they said that is to kind of show that he was distracted. So um I guess they're saying that the whole time he was there, he was distracted, or was it just a particular day? Because it almost sounds like, you know, they're saying that day he was acting strange and, um, obviously ran off. And that was, of course, very out of character, right? But are they saying like the whole time he was on the crew, he was distracted, thinking about other things?
I haven't seen anything specific around the duration of his strange behavior, but it doesn't sound like, based on what Terrence Sr. and Valerie, his mother, have said, that Simon Gee had anything really positive to say about Terrence while he was working on this project. Um, and so I would gather from that that this was pretty much his behavior throughout the trip, according to them.
Okay.
I'm speculating, obviously.
Right. And it seems to me that if something like this happened, you'd at least kind of express your condolences and, um, not dwell on the things that he did wrong, and um, you know, at least try to get answers for his family rather than kind of dwell on those things. I think that's a bit odd.
I agree. I think it sounded like he was trying to paint a picture to look the way he wanted it to look. And I'll just leave it at that.
You mentioned that two crew members who went looking for Terrence came back with ripped and bloody clothing. You said it could indicate something darker. Is there a possibility those crew members killed Terrence?
Well, you just came right out and asked it, didn't you? So this one really frustrates me because I don't think the biggest issue is whether those crew members did something to Terrence. The biggest issue for me is that investigators don't appear to have treated it like something that needed to be ruled out. My immediate thought is, why weren't those clothes tested? Why weren't they collected into evidence? If the blood was theirs, great. That's exactly what forensic testing is for. It rules things in or out. Instead, as far as the public has been told, that evidence was never even collected. That blows my mind. I'm not saying those men harmed Terrence. I have absolutely no evidence of that. But that's my point. We'll never know because no one bothered to ask the forensic questions that could have answered it. That's what makes me so angry about this case. Time after time, I keep finding things that make me ask, why wasn't this looked into? Why wasn't this documented? Why wasn't this tested? A good investigation should eliminate possibilities. If these clothes had been collected and tested, then we could cross that possibility off the list and move on. Instead, we're left here almost 8 years later asking questions that should have been answered in 2018.
So aside from the clothes, was really anything tested or taken into evidence? I guess we don't really know that without the police report, but
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to look at the police report, but it doesn't sound like anything related to the crew was taken into evidence.
okay.
All right. I'm ready when you are.
Has anyone from the crew ever spoken out since Terrence disappeared?
No, not individually. None of the crew members who were with Terrence that day have publicly given interviews or spoken directly to the media about what happened. Instead, nearly all communication has come through the production company Raw TV. Raw TV has released statements saying they cooperated with investigators and provided witness accounts and documentation. But as far as individual crew members sitting down and explaining what they saw, that simply hasn't happened.
Do we know why?
There are a few possibilities. One is that they're bound by confidentiality agreements, which are common in television productions. Another is that many members of the international crew reportedly left Idaho soon after the initial search to continue filming elsewhere. And law enforcement has said they didn't have legal grounds to require witnesses to remain in the state because there was no evidence of a crime at that point, which is one reason the production crew wasn't required to remain in Idaho. But I find that reasoning difficult to reconcile. If you don't know whether a crime occurred, wouldn't one of your first priorities be conducting thorough, in depth interviews with every person who witnessed Terrence's last known moments? It almost feels like a catch 22. The absence of evidence was used to justify not keeping the witnesses there. Yet, without fully interviewing those witnesses, how could you confidently rule out the possibility that a crime had occurred? And based on everything I've been able to find, there's no indication that comprehensive follow up interviews were ever conducted with the members of that production crew. And if they were, those interviews have never been made public. What's equally as compelling is that outside of Simon Gee, the public knows almost nothing about the people who were there that day. Who were they? Where are they now? I don't even think all of the names are in the police report based on what the Idaho County Sheriff stated on Dr. Phil, which I mentioned during episode 1. He says all of the names are there, and then at least a couple of them, but nobody really knows.
So obviously we can watch the episode that Terrence was, helping to film, see the names of the people in the credits. It's kind of hard to tell, who was there, who was not there. You don't want to start naming names when you don't really know. Um, but what are your thoughts on, you know, starting with the credits and investigating?
I like the way you're thinking. So, this mystery regarding the crew has sent me down a rabbit hole, and I've started asking so many questions about who are these people? What kind of people are they? Were their background checks conducted? And why are they being kept so secret by Raw TV? And so, here's where I have an announcement. When I released episode 1, my plan was to move on to the next case for episode 2. But over the last several days, I've decided to change course. When I started Echoes of the Missing, I had no idea where this podcast would lead me. I knew I was fascinated by true crime and have always had great compassion for missing people and their families. Then I learned of Terrence's case. and I felt deeply connected to it. I wanted to tell his story with care, put it in front of new people, and hopefully make even the smallest difference for his family. Naturally, I assumed I'd release episode 1 and then move on to another case for episode 2. That's how these true crime podcasts work, right? But somewhere along the way, that changed. I found myself digging deeper and deeper into this case, and every answer seems to lead to 3 or more questions. Every document uncovers another loose end, and the more I learn, the more convinced I become that there is still so much left to explore. I'm not done with Terrence Woods Jr.'s case. In fact, I don't think we've even begun to scratch the surface. So instead of moving on, I'm turning 11 witnesses, 0 answers into an extended investigative series, examining one question, one lead at a time, until I feel we've turned over every stone. I've already begun identifying crew members who potentially were on set the day Terrence went missing. I'm following new leads, and I'm uncovering information that I haven't seen discussed anywhere else. I can't promise where this investigation will lead, but I can promise this. I'm not walking away simply because this case is difficult. Terrence and his family deserve more. They deserve more than the minimal effort this case has received over the past 8 years. They deserve answers, and I truly believe those answers are out there. We just have to be willing to keep asking the hard questions. So for now, I'm putting episode 2's file away, and I hope that you all listening will come along on this journey with me. I want to take a moment to recognize a group that's been incredibly supportive, not just of this podcast, but of Terrence's family. Over the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to connect with the guys at Crime Redefined. They've been so kind. Crime Redefined is working alongside Terrence Sr. to raise funds for a professional, independent investigation into Terrence's disappearance. According to the team, the effort is fully backed by Terrence Sr., and the investigation will be conducted by experienced professionals, not for podcast content, but with the goal of developing evidence that could be used if the investigation uncovers something significant. The first objective is to have experts conduct a comprehensive review of Terrence's laptop and camera. From there, they hope to retrace Terrence's final known movements and follow evidence wherever it leads. They recently appeared on Nancy Grace, and they're hopeful that the increased attention will help move this effort forward. If you've listened to this episode and you're wondering, what can I do to help? This is one tangible way to make a difference. If you're able and you feel called to do so, I'll include the link to their GoFundMe in the show notes and in the episode description. Whether you donate, share the link, or simply continue talking about Terrence's story, every bit of awareness helps. And to everyone at Crime Redefined, thank you for believing in my little podcast, for the encouragement you've shown me, and most importantly, for the work you're doing on behalf of Terrence and his family.
So where do we go from here?
Well, you had your questions, and now I've got mine. Like, who is the mystery woman from the restaurant that apparently exchanged numbers with Terrence? I want to know who this woman is. I want to know if she's ever come forward. Who exactly are these crew members, and what are their backgrounds? What about Terrence's financial trail? What does that tell us? And did race play a role in how this investigation was conducted? Did it influence the urgency of response, the amount of media attention, or the resources devoted to finding Terrence? Why haven't we seen any surveillance footage of Terrence from the hotel? Was it ever reviewed? Does it even exist? Did it ever exist? And what about Terrence's journal? Why were there pages reportedly missing? Those are some of the questions we'll be exploring in the upcoming episodes. Because 11 witnesses, 0 answers isn't over. It's only the beginning. I'm your host, Jamie.
And I'm Nick.
Until next time.
Keep asking questions.
And thanks for listening to Echoes of the Missing.